Welcome to Potomac Valley Fly Fishers beginner's fly tying for the month of August 2021. Today we're going to be tying another new pattern. This pattern is referred to in various circles as a para-ant, which refers to the fact that it is tied in a parachute type fashion. That is, the hackle on this dry fly it lays horizontal with the surface of the water rather than vertical, as are many of other dry flies. So why did I choose this particular pattern for this month's beginner's fly tying? For several reasons. One of which is that during the summertime, various types of what we refer to as terrestrial insects, the ant being one, caterpillars being another, butterflies and crickets and so-called, the types of insects that live on land are commonly referred to as terrestrial insects. I chose the parachute ant, however, not because it's just happens to be one of my favorite types of patterns, but it's going to give our beginner tyers an introduction to, first of all, dry flies, secondly, tying terrestrial patterns, and thirdly, to use this relatively unique style of using the hackle to suspend the fly on the water surface and hold it that way for prolonged periods of time. So of what advantage might this be to the fly fisher? Well, for one thing, it presents the fly, the artificial fly, in the same fashion as the fish would see that particular insect if it fell upon the water. So obviously ants don't have wings, so the purpose of the parachute or the hackle is to suspend that ant right on the water surface rather than holding up above the surface, as is common with many other types of dry fly patterns. So that's why we're going to be tying this parachute ant today. So in fact, it does represent an ant, and this style of tie could be used for various other kinds of terrestrial insects, as well as other types of dry flies. And why now? Because there's a lot of ants on the water. And for some reason, I'm not sure I understand, but fish, particularly trout, seem to like ants, and I've heard that it might be because of the composition of the ant. There's some acids or something in the body of an ant that seems to be likable to the fish. Well, let's get started on tying the para-ant. The first thing I'm going to do is discuss the materials that we're going to use. It's a relatively simple fly in terms of numbers of different types of materials, but the complexity of tying this fly comes to the point where we will be tying in the parachute wing or hackle to the fly. So the first thing I'm going to do is point out that I'm using at this point a Mustad 94840 size 12 dry fly hook that's in the vise, and I've already pinched down the barb on that. I'm going to be using black thread 6/0. I will be using some ultra fine dubbing. This particular box I normally use for my dry flies. It's referred to as super fine dubbing, and I will be using some black of that dubbing. The post, which is basically an indicator, makes it a little bit more visible for the fly fisher to see. It's going to be some of this antron material, and I like the color orange because it's easier for me to see orange or chartreuse representing the post on the fly rather than white. In varying types of glare off the water, it's much easier to see that type of color than it is white. So that's why I will use the orange antron. And the parachute, or the wing part, is basically this Hoffman's dry fly hackle. And If you're not already familiar with what's referred to as dry fly hackle, it's generally the cape of or the neck of the chicken that is used because of the stiffness of the barbels in the dry fly hackle or dry fly feather. So you will see me applying that as I'm going along in tying this today. So I'm going to get started now and show you how to tie this pattern, and then as we get to the tying in the hackle wing or the parachute portion, I'll talk a little bit about various ways that can be done as found on the internet. All right, so now we're going to start the thread just behind the eye of the hook and wrap it back to the bend, just a single layer of black thread, which is going to be the sort of the underlayer to which everything is tied to. And snip off that extra piece of thread. Now I'm going to be composing the abdomen and the thorax of the ant using the black dubbing. And the first I'm going to be doing is the abdomen portion. And this should be sort of like an extenuated ball or football type abdomen. So it'll be tapered as I develop it, starting at the very rear, just about at the bend of the hook, and coming approximately halfway forward. So I'm going to dub the thread. And if you're not yet skilled at dubbing thread, particularly for dry fly, remember that you want to wrap the dubbing, just a small amount, counterclockwise on the thread as you're looking at it. So if you'll notice, in twisting the thread with my fingers, I'm wrapping it counterclockwise. I just have a relatively small amount of dubbing on there. I'm going to slide it forward and then begin to wrap it right at the very end of where I had tied in the thread. And I come forward with an initial layer, as such. And then I begin to build that into somewhat larger football shaped, as I refer to it, abdomen. A little bit more. There we go. Okay. Then I wrap the thread forward about half the way to the eye and stop at that point. And then I will cut a section of the antron yarn that is about 2 inches long. I next wrap that around the thread, the tying thread, so it forms somewhat of a U. I slide that up and hold it right on top of the hook. Make several wraps in front and behind that, and even one in between to secure that firmly. And then I begin to build up a taper of the black thread in front, which sort of creates what we might refer to as a wedge or a dam to hold that in an upright position. And then I do the same thing behind that. Okay. And now the next thing I will do is make one wrap around this post, so to speak, pull it together and hold it down like so. All right. So this is the initial steps to tying in the post which is basically going to make the fly visible to the fly fisher. At the same time, it's going to be creating an abdomen and the thorax, which you'll see a little bit later on from the fish's point of view. The next thing I'm going to do is take this pre-selected neck hackle that I've chosen, and I've chosen one that when it's tied on there, it's going to provide a parachute, so to speak, from the front of the fly to the rear of the fly. And I will show you that at the end of the video. Okay. In preparing this hackle, I'm going to first of all clip away some of this fibrous material that's down at the bottom. And then some of the fibers that's right at the stem. Now, note the next thing that I'm doing. I'm going to be turning this hackle so that the concave portion or dull portion is on my side of the fly. I'm laying the butt of that I've trimmed on my side, and I'm making a wrap over it with a thread, and then coming the other direction so that this hackle is then tied in with the dull side facing me, and it's standing straight up. The next thing I will do is just lay my thread over the far side of the hook. And you can trim off that little stub that's at the bottom at this point. And what I have found in preparing this fly is that this is a good place to put a very small drop of quick drying epoxy cement just at the base of where I've tied the hackle feather into the post. And you'll see me do that right now. I'm just going to put a very tiny drop on my bodkin and touch it to that base there. We don't want to get too much of this on there, otherwise it's going to impede some of the next steps that I'm going to be doing. So at this point, I'm going to make several wraps of thread up this post that's about 3 or 4, and then back down. At this point, that cement has dried pretty well. Okay, so we now have the post and the hackle feather tied in, and we have taken a small drop of head cement or quick dry epoxy to solidify the base of this. The next thing I will do is take a little bit more dubbing and dub the thread to create the thorax of the fly. Notice what I've done. I've put a small amount on my thread, and I've slid it up the thread, and now I'm making what I refer to as X-wraps, going in front and behind the post, in front and behind the post, a little bit more. Leaving my thread hanging on the back side of the post. I'm now going to stop the process and remove the hook from the vise and turn it perpendicular to the tying bench. Now, you might consider, if you like tying parachute patterns, to invest in what I refer to as a parachute tool. And I'm holding mine down, though I'm not going to use it today. but this is simply a spring-type mechanism. They're relatively inexpensive that you fasten a clamp to of some sort, and that will hold the post up out of the way for you to complete your tie. But I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to show you the method that's more commonly used. And I see a small thread there that I want to clip out before I go any further. Okay, now that we're at this point, I'm going to put the hackle into the hackle pliers. I'm going to break the hackle, so to speak, by just pulling gently down on it. That sort of breaks the stem a little bit and makes it easier to wrap. Now, we will gently, while putting a little bit of tension on this feather, want to gently begin to wrap it around the base of the hook. And notice that I did this in a clockwise fashion, as if I were looking at the fly from the post down. So I'm wrapping this counterclockwise, and that will take the curvature of the hackle to be such that it's going to help suspend the fly. Each wrap that I'm making, I'm going closer and closer to the body of the fly. Rather than going up the post, I'm going down the post. So each successive one is underneath the previous ones. After I've done maybe 4 to 5, and sort of running out of feather to use, I'm at the lowest point. And then I shift hands, so I put my hackle pliers in the left hand, the thread in the right, and now I'm coming underneath the last wrap of hackle and around the post with about 3 wraps. I can now clip that off. That extra hackle I'm clipping off. And then I'm using my half-hitch tool to create several half hitches right underneath that wing or that bit of hackle that we've just applied. Just making several wraps like so. And that will secure the fly. Now, in essence, the fly is just about finished as I'm tying it this way. However, if you have not been familiar with using a half-hitch tool and you just want to do it, or I'm sorry, if you're not familiar with a whip finisher and you want to use your half-hitch tool, just tip your fly back up to the original position and make 1 or 2 half hitches with the remaining thread right in front of the thorax. Cut the thread, trim the post just to be maybe 1/4 of an inch long. And then I would rotate the fly a little bit so I can look at the underside and just trim away if there's any fibers underneath there that's going to give me a problem. And so I hope that you can see the finished para ant as it would appear to the fish from underneath the surface of the water. There's a little stripe right there. Okay. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed today's session, and I hope that you have learned a few things about tying parachute patterns, particularly the para ant. Of course, here's several that I've been tying today, and I look forward to having a chance to use these. And speaking about how to use or how to fish this fly, it's fished basically as like a conventional dry fly. Can be fished with a dropper, although I don't know whether that's necessary. We basically want to simulate a ant that has fallen to the water, so we want to be careful about mending our lines so that they don't have drag. It should be a drag-free drift, as we would call it. imparting very little movement to it, because after all, ants are not, they might be struggling to get out of the water, but they're not prolific swimmers. So a little bit of just a little twitch or so might help. But if you are fishing this fly, you might consider what we call putting some floatant on your leader, or greasing the leader as commonly is referred to. But remember, you don't want to grease the leader, so to speak, all the way up to the fly. You should have about a foot or so of the very last part of the leader where it ties onto the fly, which you don't put any floatant on. Therefore, the fish are going to be less likely to be spooked by the leader. So I hope that you've learned something today, not only about tying a parachute patterns, learned a little bit about using something like a para-ant as a terrific fly to use at this time of the year. But don't isolate the use of it just to fishing for trout, because all species like terrestrials. And if you were even going to fish for smallmouth bass, you might use the same technique, but use either a larger terrestrial or indeed a large ant. Fish like them, and so don't limit the possibilities when you're out this summer. Water's low, but the fish are looking up. Have a great day.